How's it going, everyone? This is Kevin. Today I want to bring along with me to talk about why I would pick the new FX30 over the Sony A7 IV. So let's jump right into it. With the new announcement of the Sony FX30 for their cinema line, I thought it would be great to talk about one of the talking points that I think would be helpful when it comes down to picking your next camera when it comes down for video. Now I'm comparing it to the Sony A7 IV because of the price point of what it comes with, but I know a lot of people have been comparing it with the FX3 since that's their cinema line camera, in their whole spectrum, since they have the FX6 and so on and so forth. But for me, I feel like it competes more with the Sony A7 IV, not only because of the price point, but also with what the specs are for when it comes down to this camera. This camera is sadly APS-C mode, but it does make sense because they're trying to dive into a little bit more of the cinema line when it comes down to the FX series into the APS-C mode, I guess, to my understanding. Now, comparing it to the A7 IV, theoretically the A7 IV for video specs is full frame, except you do get that crop at 4K 60. That's why it's kind of interesting for me when it came down to this camera to pin it against the A7 IV and some of the specs that I think will correlate more to having a better camera for video when it comes down with the FX30 over the A7 IV. So now we're gonna go ahead and dive into a little bit more of the reasoning why I think this would be a better camera than picking the A7 IV if you're only choosing for the video specs. As I was talking previously a second ago, the Sony A7 IV has full frame, but it does have crop mode, which that kind of hinders a little bit of what the Sony A7 IV can do when it comes down to the video specs, since it's more of a hybrid camera that does some video in really good quality, but it's mainly centered with that, photography side, where it doesn't hinder a little bit of both, but it just succeeds in both to a certain spectrum that makes sense. Now with the Sony FX30, I think this is a camera that would be beneficial if you're wanting to shoot video, because you get that 4K 120 all the way throughout at 10-bit color when it comes down to this camera. So 4K 24 all the way to 120 is 4K and 10-bit color. Now if you compare that to the Sony A7 IV, you're only getting 4K at 10-bit color up until the 4K 60, and that's with a crop at the 4K 60. You do get that 10-bit at the 120 frames per second if you do the S&Q mode that I've made a video about, but you do shoot it at 1080p. So now another thing when it comes down to the slow motion, you can also get the 240 frames per second that the Sony FX3 and the Sony A7S III have with the 1080p at 10-bit. So that's something really cool to consider as well if you're wanting to have more slow motion in a camera, which the FX30 has that the Sony A7 IV doesn't. Now, a big factor that comes down to that's even not so much the specs related, but because we're comparing them like that, the Sony A7 IV coming out about $2,500, the Sony FX30 comes at $1,800, which is pretty mind-blowing with what the specs come of it. I know it's because it's APS-C mode, they have to kind of lower the price of it, so it makes sense. But the specs of what you're getting for that price point is quite unreal. Getting 4K all the way to 120 at 10-bit for $1,800 is pretty crazy to me. Now, granted, you won't get a lot of the good specs that a lot of those full frame cameras have, especially the FX3, but if you compare it to the FX3, it's $3,800. So you could get two of these cameras for the price of almost one in a sense, and be able to still get some, good video with two cameras to have an A and B camera of the same style. Now, what's crazy to me is that they claim to have dual native ISO. From the videos that I've seen personally, because sadly I'm not there yet with Sony to, send me cameras to test them out for you guys. Hopefully one day though, because I do enjoy, reviewing these cameras, even though if it is what it is. But from what I've seen, a lot of people do say that the dual native ISO, it's okay. I mean, it's not going to be as nice as it can be with a full frame camera, but you still get a nice, decent low light capabilities when it comes down to the FX30 that you can essentially get with the A7 IV. Now, APS-C mode to me has always had a little bit more harsher time with low light, but it's still something nice to have when it comes down to an FX30 for $1,800 that you can use as a cinema camera style. Which, speaking of a cinema camera kind of style, this body is essentially the same as the FX3. It might be a little bit lighter accordingly, but it looks the same to me, which the cool thing about it is you can get that XLR cable handle where you can just have the handle to connect the better audio, which is really nice if you're planning to do a lot more, let's say podcasting, so you want to record already directly into the camera, or if you're trying to do more cinema line kind of work. So that's actually something pretty cool, because it comes down to about, let me double check, don't want to give you the wrong numbers, but if you do get the body itself is $17.98, but if you get with the handle is $21.98. So a bit of a difference, but it allows you to connect a microphone, like how if you're doing with this one right here that you can kind of see, be able to just directly plug it in without having to have all these external recordings or also external kind of type of connectors to connect to your camera, like how I personally do. So right there and there, it allows you to modify the camera to be more cinematic for purposes that you can use daily than the A7 IV. So that's something that I think that's pretty cool, that if I was just to do more video centered, I think the FX30 for the money wise makes more sense right now for me with the specs that I see. Personally, I can't compare it obviously, but going by the spec sheet and what I've been kind of seeing from other people, it does make sense with how much you can get out of that camera for the body style and also the price point. And now, despite of it being an APS-C mode, I know a lot of people don't like, the crop mode of cameras because of the bokeh is a little bit different than the full frame. For the majority of the things, you won't be able to tell much of the difference, at least from what I've seen in other people's videos. And in reality, it's just like, it's a minor thing that here and there you might be able to tell, so don't stress out too much about it. Yes, full frame tends to have a lot nicer, smoother bokeh in my opinion, but it also, are you willing to invest that money to go to a more higher cinema line camera like the FX3 or the A7S III because of the specs that those cameras have? Because the A7 IV, despite of it being obviously in the $2,500 range, and it has the full frame theoretically all the way throughout except the 4K 60, you do get that nice bokeh. The 4K 24 frames per second is one of my favorite things in all honesty, but in reality, and it comes down to it too, it's just, do I want to have more options when it comes down to the video, like the 4K 120? How much are you willing to, spend for? Are you wanting to go all the way to an A7S III, FX3, or are you fine with having the crop mode in the style of the FX30 to maybe having 1080p at 120 with the A7 IV? That's something to consider when it comes down to just, realizing what you want and what would make sense. For me, the 4K 120 at 10-bit color would make more sense, even if it's APS-C mode, with having the FX30 that way, because I feel like at least the quality, even though it's crop mode, it's 4K, you're not having to, upscale anything, just makes more sense personally. So I believe that the FX30 would be a perfect startup cinema camera that's not going to break the bank, and you can really dive into to have good specs with the camera. You have all the way from 4K 24 to 120 at 10-bit. You get the, the slow motion of 240 at 1080p. Plus, you get that dual native ISO, which should be fairly good enough. I know from what I was hearing, it's like the 800 is the base ISO, but the 2500 is a dual native ISO, which the A7 IV has it at 32 with the S-Log 3, which is fine enough, and I've used it plenty, and it's pretty clean image still. Despite of it being APS-C, I think for the bang for your buck of what you can obtain with this camera and the FX30 to the A7 IV would make more sense if I was doing more video. If you're wanting to have a solid hybrid camera, then this video is probably not for you. Probably disregard this, because it's more, you want to have a full frame camera for photos and then still have full frame video for the most part, and then have some crop. Well, then obviously the A7 IV is better. But for me personally, if I was doing just video only and more wanting to have a startup cinema camera, the FX30 for $1,800 seems almost like a steal for what you're getting out of it. That itself is a good investment into the cinema lines eventually, but if you want to wait a little bit longer to fork over, to get that full frame all the way throughout, then obviously you're not really caring how it happens with the 4K crop mode all the way to the 120 with the FX30, you're going to hold off anyway. Because if you're wanting that full frame view, then maybe, fork over the cash and, save it up and go for that. But if you want to save up some money to then get some good quality glass that you can have full frame style glass to eventually, develop into a full frame lineup, then I would suggest going with the $1,800 FX30, because that just makes more sense to me personally. I could probably get two of them to have a solid lineup of cameras for any kind of jobs at a good price point and still have good quality video when it comes down to these cameras. But personally, I'm hoping one day I'm able to compare the FX30 to the A7 IV that I have and my Sony A7S III, just to see how much in reality me doing more testing, like vigorously kind of pixel peeping a little bit, makes sense. But out of seeing all the videos and all the specs that I see comparing them to each other, I think the more direct competitor of the FX30 is the A7 IV rather than the FX3, despite of it being a cinema kind of startup camera that they're trying to do for the cinema line. Because I know I've seen a lot of people compare it to the FX3, which in reality, specs wise, yes, but because of the full frame mode to the APS-C mode, I think it's an unfair advantage. And it does make sense to compare it to the price point with the A7 IV. But that's just me personally. I don't know. What do you think about the new camera? Is it something that's worth your money to go for and get rid of maybe your APS-C mode that you already had in before going to a full frame, keep it APS-C with going the FX30, or do you think going to a full frame makes more sense for you? Would love to know your thoughts on that, and as always, comment it down below so we can have a nice little discussion to hear your thoughts, see if you agree with me or if it's something that you think it's not worth it, or you think the A7 IV still reigns superior. I personally still have the A7 IV, don't plan to get the FX30, but if I had to buy one of the cameras now and I'm more video centered, the FX30 is quite enticing when it comes down to picking it over the A7 IV. But that's just me. But with all that said and done, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to like and subscribe, share this video with a friend. I'll catch you guys in the next one. See ya.